And Officer Gore takes his revolver out and he points it at the vehicle and he starts issuing commands from the front left fender of the CHP vehicle. And Gore is ordering the felons to come out of the vehicle with their hands up. They're not complying. We've got a lot of things that are going on here in a very short time frame that send up a lot of warning flags to us now in retrospect. But it appears that our officers, as young as they were, may not have seen some of these signs and they may not have recognized them for their importance. And so they proceeded to make contact with the suspects. As he opens the door, the passenger throws the door open, and the passenger who is twining, he fires 2 rounds from a .357 Magnum revolver and shoots and kills Officer Frago instantly. Throughout the course of this fight, every time the felons would run dry with their weapons, they would simply fetch another loaded one out of the car. There's a third storyline that runs through this, which is interesting. The storyline is that there's a citizen that's driving to work, and his name is Gary Kness. Gary's a former Marine with combat experience in Korea, and he sees the second CHP cruiser containing Allen and Pence drive past him as they exit the Henry Mayo Drive and drive up the old road into the service station. And Gary's driving on that way because he's going to work. And Gary follows the CHP cruiser loosely up past the service station, and he sees this gunfight playing out. And Gary would tell us later that he thought at first it was some kind of movie being filmed. He didn't think it was a real incident. But he realized pretty quickly that this was a real gunfight that was happening. And he sees Officer Allen go down from Davis's attack with a shotgun. And Gary decides that he's going to try to help rescue Officer Allen.
Hello, America. Welcome to your Leo Nation, where we believe in and support the rule of law. I am the Chief, Mark Garrett. We are very pleased, very excited today to have this guest on. I want to preface this before I introduce the guest. Here I was, 30-year member of the California Highway Patrol. I retired as a chief of the CHP. And it wasn't until about 10 days ago that I read the book whose author that we have on today. The reason I say that is because I'm kind of embarrassed and a little ashamed about that. The reason is because the book that our author wrote is, I think, probably the best documentation of one of the most significant law enforcement tragedies in American history. So with that said, I'd like to introduce Mike Wood. Mike, it is such a pleasure and again, an honor to have you on today.
Thank you, Mark. Very gracious introduction. I certainly appreciate that. And I'm glad to be here with the Leo Nation audience.
Mike, you wrote the book, Newhall Shooting, a Tactical Analysis. And I will not get much into it myself because that's why we have you, the expert, on. But Newhall refers to one of the California Highway Patrol stations, or area office as they are officially referred to, in the city of Newhall, which is in northern Los Angeles County. And this shooting, this incident took place now 54 years ago. You wrote the book 10 years ago. And as a cadet in the academy, as a member of the patrol, we were made very aware of the Newhall incident, as it's referred to in the agency. A lot of training, a lot of video about the shooting when I was a cadet. But again, I didn't read your book until just very recently, and boy, I wish I had read it a long time ago because, quite frankly, it would have given me some insight and I think some really advantages as a manager had I read this book while I was still in the department. So with that said, I would love for you to give the audience a little background on yourself and really kind of what motivated you specifically to write such a great book.
Well, thank you. I grew up as part of the greater CHP family. My dad was a highway patrolman for 30 years, started his career in the beginning of 68 and retired mid-98. And so we were surrounded by the highway patrol from the very start. And my brother and I had intentions of following our dad into a law enforcement career. And so we paid attention at very early ages to what was going on with his job and the environment that he worked in. And we were fortunate to kind of have a front row seat to a lot of things. You know, times were different back then. My dad was able to pop a couple young kids in the patrol car and drive them around on duty, and you know, he was able to take us out of school, and we'd work the range on the days that he was running the office through their qualifications as range master. He'd fetch us out of school for the day, and we'd change targets and pick up brass and do all the grunt work so the officers didn't have to do it. And we thought it was Christmas in July. And so we grew up surrounded by law enforcement and paid attention to it at a very early age. And because of where we grew up in Southern California, our travels would fairly frequently bring us through the Newhall area. And when we passed through that area, you know, Dad would share things with us about the story of the four officers there. They were all contemporaries of his. You know, my dad beat them out of the academy by about probably about 8 months for a couple of the officers, and by a couple of years for the latest officer. And so they were all contemporaries. And so this gunfight was a major shaping event for the highway patrol, but also, as we'll talk about, for the law enforcement culture in general across the United States. And as such a foundational part of the California Highway Patrol's history, as you said, it's something that was really ingrained in all the officers since. But for those who were on the patrol at the time, it was a very major force in the way that it shaped their careers. And so Dad had an interest in the event and passed on anecdotes about it to us as we were growing up. And I kind of cataloged some of those things in the back of my brain, and they popped out 30 or 40 years later in the book here.
Well, you know, you do an excellent job. And again, some people might think that I'm just throwing out platitudes, things like this. I've read a lot of books on law enforcement, as you might think. But even with that background you give, especially with someone who's very familiar with the CHP Newhall area, the way you describe the setting, describe driving down the 5 freeway, it really hits home. You do a very good job of laying the foundation for why you got to where you did with this book. The book is so well done. When I read this, I thought, you know what, this is not a show that I should do by myself, which brings us, of course, to our semi-regular guest, Bill Bodner. Bill Bodner was a special agent in charge of the DEA in Los Angeles field office. And I thought, I need somebody on here who's analytical, who's very thoughtful. And, you know, Bill is really the only person that I thought would fit that role. And so, Bill, welcome you to you as well today. So glad to have you on.
Thank you, Mark.
So, Mike,
Sir.
Yeah, what I want to do is really kind of get out of the way. And, you know, Bill and I will chime in as we, you know, see fit. Even having read the book, there's still a lot of curiosity I have about certain things. But I would just love for you to go ahead and talk about in a chronological order from a very high altitude. By the way, ladies and gentlemen, you are not going to get all the details today that are in this book. And I highly recommend that you look up Mike Wood and look up Newhall incident, the shooting, and get the book. It's fabulous. We're going to promote it again later on, but it's something that everybody that cares about law enforcement should read. So, Mike, with that said, I'll turn it over, and we'll let you do what you do.
Okay. Well, I guess our story kind of starts with taking a look at where California was at in April of 1970. It was a growing state. The interstates, which crisscross our state and the nation, were still kind of in their infancy in many ways. And in particular, in this area of northern LA County, what's now Interstate 5 was still being constructed in a lot of places. It was still being built. And so the major north-south highway through the area at the time had been the old road, as it's now called. It's the portions of the old Highway 99. But the Interstate 5 was being built parallel to it, and it was cutting its way through the mountains north of Los Angeles. And so there was a lot of construction sites out there that had explosives and so forth for blowing through the rock so that they could create a way for the interstate. And these explosives were the attraction for a pair of felons that had met each other in prison and had been paroled. And when they got out, they decided that they wanted to go back into the game of robbing banks and robbing armored cars together. And so they thought that it would be advantageous if they could find some of these explosives at these construction sites to help them in the furtherance of their crimes. And so on the night of April 5th, 1970, this pair of felons, Bobby Davis and Jack Twining, they were combing the mountains north of Los Angeles there looking for these explosives. And they were also doing some other things. They had a carload full of guns that they were testing and training with. And they also had a set of walkie talkies that they had purchased. And what they were hoping to do is just to kind of test those walkie talkies and see what their effective range was and get a little practice using them. And so at one point in the evening, Jack Twining was on foot in the mountains there with the walkie talkie, and Bobby Davis was parked over on the shoulder of the interstate with his. And they were doing some testing of the walkie talkies there. And Davis was parked in a Pontiac, and he kind of got the attention of some other motorists that were stopped alongside the highway. And he noticed that these motorists kept glancing at him and kept looking at him and trying to figure out what he was doing. And he felt like he was getting a little bit too much attention, so he decided that he was going to make a U-turn across the dirt median of the highway, and he was going to drive in the other direction. And when he made that U-turn across the brand new Interstate 5 in that area, he wound up cutting off a motorist that was going southbound. And that motorist was really mad at him for cutting him off. And so some threatening gestures and so forth were exchanged. One thing led to another, and the motorist convinced Davis to pull over so he could give him a piece of his mind. And as Davis pulled up alongside the motorist to begin this confrontation, he pointed a gun at the motorist through the window of his Pontiac. And the motorist realized at that point that he and his wife were in great danger, and he'd bitten off a lot more than he could chew. And so he did the first smart thing of the night, and he played a very effective ruse on Davis. He said, you know, I just passed a cop back there a few minutes ago. He's going to be here on top of us any moment, so you better let us go. And so Davis waved off the motorist with the gun, told him to get out of there. And the motorist wound up driving down the road, found the first payphone he could find, and called into the highway patrol and said, hey, this guy with a gun just threatened me, and here's his description, here's the license plate of the car. And so at that point, the highway patrol was beginning to look for Davis in his red Pontiac and talk to him about this brandishing incident as it was reported. And we had several officers that were patrolling in the area of Newhall and Valencia in that area. One of the sets of officers was a car that was driven by Officer Roger Gore and his partner, Walter Frago. And they were in the vicinity of Castaic Junction, for those of you that might be familiar with the area. It was a cross highway to Interstate 5 that was in the area, a little bit south of where this incident had been reported. And so they were looking out for this Pontiac. And lo and behold, before too long, that Pontiac is driving southbound on Interstate 5. And so our two officers pull in behind it, and they start to trail him. And they hatched a plan with some other officers in the area that they were going to team up and have two cars join in on the stop because there was a gun involved with the incident. And so there were some officers that were a little bit further south on the interstate, Mike Allen and James Pence. And they were a little bit further south on the interstate. And so the plan was that that Gore and Frago would continue to follow the suspect vehicle southbound on the interstate until they passed the position that Pence and Allen were waiting at. And then Pence and Allen would come in behind him and join in the chase, and then the two cars would stop these guys and see what's going on.
And Mike, let me just interrupt you there. At the time, it's very important, I think, for people to realize at the time that brandishing of a firearm from a vehicle was a misdemeanor, if I'm not mistaken. Is that correct?
It was.
It was correct. Now, and go ahead.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I was just going to say, and the other element of that is that because this was such a rural area at the time, there was a whole lot of hunters and target shooters and everything else up there. And so these calls were relatively common. Mm-hmm. In fact, Skip Pence, one of the officers involved, had just the night before received a similar call of an incident like this involving somebody that had a firearm. And so mentally, to take a look at where our officers were, this was not as extraordinary an event as it might be for other officers in other jurisdictions. This was relatively common for them to encounter motorists with firearms in this area. So,
yeah. And I'm so glad for you to give detail about that, but I did want to get a little bit into, and I know you will, but the mindset of the officers, because today that same violation is a felony in California. And so, and as you laid out, this was not uncommon in that area. By the way, the Newhall area is still a somewhat rural area. Many parts of it are still very rural. So as we go down the line here, just wanted people to realize what was going through the officer's mind at the time.
Yep, absolutely. I'm glad you stopped me to emphasize that, because that's important. So Gore and Frago are following our suspect southbound with the intention of linking up with Allen and Pence. And our suspect in a vehicle does something unplanned. And I should back up and mention that between the time that our motorist was threatened and the time that our officers start to fall behind this Pontiac, Davis had picked up his partner Twining. So there's now two people in the vehicle. And originally the call had gone out to the highway patrol that a single motorist had threatened the citizen with a gun. Now there's two people in the car, and that will also go into some of the mental and mindset things that we'll talk about a little bit later. And so our felons realize that we've got the highway patrol following them there, and they get a little antsy, and they decide that they want to exit the interstate. And they exit at off-ramp called Henry Mayo Drive, which your modern viewers may recognize as Magic Mountain Parkway if they're familiar with the area. And so they exit the interstate and drive north just a couple blocks, and they enter into the parking lot of a all-night diner and a standard service station. And the way that this parking lot is set up, there's a rail fence that surrounds the parking lot, and there's a small little driveway access that goes into the service apron for the gas station. And the parking lot for the diner is off to the vehicle's right. And these felons that are in the car, they stop their vehicle in the throat of that driveway that leads into the service station. So a very unusual place for them to stop. And our officers, Gore and Frago, follow behind them, and their hand has kind of been forced by the suspects at this point. And there had been no plan to stop the vehicle prior to getting the other highway patrol vehicle there, but the felons have kind of played the trump card, and so they're initiating the action and beginning the confrontation with the officers by doing this. So as Gore and Frago are exiting the highway, they call on the radio to their partners, Allen and Pence, that are a little bit further south, and they advise them that the vehicle they're following is exiting the highway. And so Pence and Allen respond from a mile south. They have to back their car up the on-ramp to the southbound part of the freeway, reverse direction, and drive north a mile, exit the interstate, and go to the gas station parking lot where their partners have stopped this vehicle. That takes them just a little over a minute to do that. But in the meantime, all hell is going to break loose for the highway patrolmen. Officer Gore is the driver of the vehicle behind the suspect vehicle. Officer Frago is in the passenger side. And so Officer Frago exits the vehicle with the department issue Remington 870, and he stands at a position up near the right front headlight of the CHP cruiser. And Officer Gore takes his revolver out and he points it at the vehicle and he starts issuing commands from the front left fender of the CHP vehicle. And Gore is ordering the felons to come out of the vehicle with their hands up. And they're not complying. And Gore has to issue the commands several times over before the felons finally decide to comply. And when they do, only one of them does. The driver exits the vehicle, but the suspect in the passenger seat elects to remain inside the vehicle, not following commands to exit. So,
Mike, can I jump in just for clarification?
Yes,
so the initial commands were they were directing both occupants out of the car. They didn't, right?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah. The command was exit the vehicle with your hands up, and so the intent was to have both passenger and driver exit the vehicle, but only the driver complied with the commands to do it, and he had to be told several times to keep his hands up as well. When he finally exited the vehicle, his hands kept wanting to drift down from the surrender position up over his head. And so he had to be told several times by Officer Gore to keep your hands up. We told you to keep your hands up, is what witnesses to the event would later recount to the investigating officers. So you've got right away a series of non-compliant actions from our suspects, right? As we had discussed, this event started with one suspect threatening the motorist with a gun in the Little Road Rage incident. Now we have two people in this vehicle, so things are starting to be a little bit different than the initial report. And we've stopped this vehicle, and the Highway Patrol didn't actually stop the vehicle stopped itself, right? The felons chose the place where they wanted to stop their vehicle. They stopped it in an unusual location that channelized the Highway Patrol vehicle and got them stuck essentially in the throat of a narrow driveway. And now we've got a driver who's being non-compliant with his commands to keep his hands over his head when he's exited the vehicle. And we've got a passenger suspect that is completely non-compliant and refusing to exit the vehicle when commanded to. So we've got a lot of things that are going on here in a very short time frame that send up a lot of warning flags to us now in retrospect. But it appears that our officers, as young as they were, may not have seen some of these signs and they may not have recognized them for their importance. And so they proceeded to make contact with the suspects. And Officer Gore advanced to the suspect's vehicle to pat down, frisk, and place the driver into custody.
And Mike, I want to step in there. And again, Gore is the driver officer of
Correct.
the first unit that made the stop, or actually pulled in behind the suspects as they stopped. And he's armed with a revolver.
Correct.
Handgun. Yeah. So just want to set that up there for the audience. So go ahead.
Yeah, and so Officer Gore has holstered his revolver so that he can go ahead and search the driver on the driver's side of the vehicle. He places him in what we'd call a wall search position, right? So the suspect is standing with his hands on the roof of the Pontiac and his feet are, spread a little bit. And so Gore is searching him in that position. And for reasons that we don't understand right now, and we'll never understand because we aren't able to talk to these officers, but we can have some speculation about it. Officer Frago, who was the cover officer back at the Highway Patrol cruiser with the shotgun, he elects to leave his position as cover officer and advance on the vehicle, and he walks to the passenger side of the vehicle with the intent to extract the non-compliant passenger. Now, Officer Frago has an 870 shotgun in his hands, and as he approaches the passenger side of the vehicle, he shifts the shotgun to a position where the buttstock is resting on his right hip, right above where his revolver is. And with his left hand, he's reaching out to the door handle on the side of the Pontiac to pull the door open and order the passenger to come out. And as he opens the door, the passenger throws the door open, and the passenger, who is Twining, he fires 2 rounds from a .357 Magnum revolver and shoots and kills Officer Frago instantly. Officer Frago's hit twice in the chest and goes down immediately. And Twining then turns to face Officer Gore across the trunk of the Pontiac on the other side, where he's busy searching the driver and patting him down. Gore obviously sees the action on the other side of the vehicle, sees his partner get shot, and so he draws his revolver and he fires 1 shot at the threat across the other side of the car, and unfortunately that shot misses. But in the process of shooting at the suspect on the other side of the vehicle, his attention has been diverted away from the suspect that he was just in the process of searching on the driver's side. And so that suspect, Davis, he pulls out the same gun that he had threatened the motorists with earlier in the night, and he shoots Officer Gore twice at contact distance.
And Mike, you said he pulled out that weapon. That weapon was in his waistband, correct?
Yeah, in a waistband or a jacket pocket somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And so Officer Gore hadn't found it yet during his search, unfortunately. So he shoots Officer Gore twice with the snub 38 that he had on him, a Smith & Wesson Model 38, and Officer Gore expires right there. Now, we had talked about how they had Officer Gore and Officer Frago had radioed their partners and said, hey, the vehicle we're following is stopping, and here's where you can find us. Come on up and give us a hand with the stop. And so they were responding from a mile south, and roughly a minute to a minute and a half later, they arrive on scene. And they pull up to see Officer Gore going down, getting shot. So they arrive just as Officer Gore is getting shot. And they immediately come under fire from the 2 armed felons now. Davis is on the driver's side of the Pontiac with the snub revolver that he had just shot Officer Gore with. Twining is on the passenger side of the Pontiac with the .357 he just shot Officer Frago with. And so they empty their revolvers at the CHP vehicle as it's driving into the scene. And the driver of the second vehicle, Officer Pence, he pulls his vehicle up to the left side of the existing highway patrol car. So essentially you have 2 highway patrol cars that are roughly parked side by side with each other in the narrow throat of this driveway, with the suspect's vehicle in front of them, about maybe 1 or 2 car lengths parked in front of them. So the distances in this gunfight are relatively short, the distance of a couple car lengths, if you will. So Officer Pence is driving, and as they pull up on the scene, they start taking fire from the 2 bad guys. Officer Pence gets on the radio, and he puts out an officer needs assistance call, an 1199 call in CHP radio parlance, and he identifies that there are 1199 shots have been fired, and there's Jay's service station. The diner and the service station, the standard service station. So that starts a response from highway patrol units that are scattered throughout the area, particularly units that are in the downtown Newhall area, which is roughly about 5 miles away from the scene of the shooting. And also officers are coming from the truck scales up in Castaic, which are a little bit further north up the interstate. And so Officer Pence puts out the 1199 call as they come under fire when they arrive on the scene. Officer Allen, the passenger officer, gets the department issue 870 shotgun out of the locking cradle that's in the vehicle. And the 2 officers now exit their vehicle under fire from the 2 felons that are in front of them at the Pontiac. Now, we had talked earlier about how the 2 felons were doing a bunch of target shooting during their day's activities and their night's activities up north. And so they had a vehicle that was full of loaded firearms. And so throughout the course of this fight, every time the felons would run dry with their weapons, they would simply fetch another loaded one out of the car. And so at this point, the two felons have run their revolvers dry, and so they fish around in the vehicle for more guns to continue their gunfight. And Davis comes up with a pump shotgun, and Twining comes up with a 1911 pistol. And Davis is going to continue firing at our officers with the shotgun. And Twining attempts to fire at the officers with the 1911 pistol, but suffers a malfunction with it that he's unable to clear. And so he ditches the gun inside the car, and he goes into the car to go fetch a single or separate 1911 pistol from the car. While Davis is inside the car trying to get that second pistol, our passenger officer from the second vehicle, Officer Allen, has begun to fire at the two suspects with his 870 shotgun. And he fires the gun through the rear window of the passenger of the Pontiac, and he strikes Twining with one of the pellets from the buckshot load that he has in the 870. And the pellet hits Twining in the upper part of his forehead, and it courses across the top of his scalp, and it cuts a really nasty gash in the top of his forehead. And it doesn't incapacitate him, though. It just makes him angry. And so Twining is partially wounded with this buckshot pellet, but we haven't been able to land a hit on Davis yet. Officer Pence is firing with his revolver from behind the driver's side door of his CHP cruiser. And he's also putting fire on Twining while Twining is inside the vehicle. And homicide investigators will later reconstruct where his rounds are hitting on the vehicle. And unfortunately, they're impacting the car, but they're not hitting either of the suspects. So Davis has been firing his shotgun at these officers, and he's firing from a position at the front bumper of the Pontiac, using the length of the car for cover from the officers. And so Davis decides that he is going to assault the position that our two officers are firing from. And he's got particular attention on Officer Allen, who has run his 870 shotgun dry, and he has retreated to the rear bumper of the first CHP car on scene. And he is firing at Davis using his revolver now from the rear bumper of the CHP car that's on the right side of our battle space here. So Davis decides he's going to assault Allen's position, and he advances on the two CHP cars, and he comes to essentially a position that's between the two CHP cars, right up near the front bumper of both CHP cars, right in the middle of them there. And as Davis is firing at Allen, Allen is kind of popping up and down at the rear of his vehicle there, trying to find the suspect, fire a shot at him, then duck down for cover, and then he'll come back from behind cover, locate the suspect, fire a shot, and duck down behind cover. And while he's doing this bobbing maneuver at the rear of the CHP vehicle, Davis is advancing on his position with the shotgun. And at one point, when Officer Allen pops up from behind the cruiser, Davis fires 2 loads of buckshot at him and hits him in the face and the chest. And Allen falls down, mortally wounded, at the rear of the CHP vehicle at that point. Davis has run his shotgun dry in the course of doing this. And so what he does is he retreats back to the front of his Pontiac and stops on the way to go fetch the loaded shotgun from Officer Frago that had been laying on the ground. And he also takes the revolver out of Officer Frago's holster to rearm himself with a live gun.
Now, Mike, let me just chime in because there's a lot going on, and that's why the book is so good. Yeah. I want to remind the audience that Frago was the first officer killed who made the right side or the passenger side approach on the Pontiac and was shot point blank range into the chest. So that's where that shotgun came from, probably 2 or maybe 3 minutes earlier at this point. Is that correct?
Right. Yeah.
And both those guns were fully loaded because he did not fire at all, correct?
Absolutely. Hadn't
Right.
fired a shot yet at this point. So Davis puts the loaded CHP shotgun in the back of the Pontiac, and he picks up the revolver from Officer Frago's holster, and he returns to the front of the Pontiac and continues to fire on Allen with the revolver. Allen is laying in a position where he's partly exposed. If you can imagine, he's at the rear of the CHP cruiser, and his right head and his upper chest are exposed beyond the right rear corner of the CHP cruiser. And his legs and so forth are behind the rear bumper, but his upper torso and his head are exposed on the right side of the CHP cruiser at the rear. And so Davis is firing at the downed Officer Allen as he lay incapacitated in that position. While all this engagement is happening between Davis and Allen, Officer Pence on the driver's side of his vehicle is engaged in a running gunfight with Twining. And Twining, we mentioned, had been in the vehicle and was securing another 1911 pistol that he could continue his gunfight with, and he was injured by one of Allen's buckshot pellets. But it doesn't stop him. And so he emerges from that Pontiac with the 1911, and unfortunately the second one is working perfectly, and he begins a running gunfight with Officer Pence. Officer Pence is shooting from a position behind the open door of his cruiser, and he runs his 6-shot revolver dry. And so he retreats to a position at the left rear of his cruiser to be able to reload his revolver and get back in the fight. And as he's doing this, Twining begins a wide flanking maneuver on the left side. And what he's doing is he's trying to get a better angle on Officer Pence, where he can fire at Officer Pence without having to get through the cover of his CHP's cruiser door. And so Twining starts this wide flanking maneuver out to the left. Unfortunately, Pence is relatively head down trying to reload his revolver. And as he's reloading his revolver, Pence is shooting at him from his left, and he winds up hitting Officer Pence several times. One of the .45 caliber rounds goes through Pence's left upper leg and shatters the femur there and continues on through his right leg. He also takes 2 rounds that impact him in the left hip and the left abdominal area. So he's been shot multiple times with this .45 pistol, and he's still in the process of trying to reload his revolver 1 round at a time. And we'll talk about it perhaps a little bit more in the equipment section later, but the state of the art for CHP officers at the time was to have a leather box that contained loose cartridges in it, and you'd pop a snap and those cartridges would spill out into your hand, and then you'd have to load those one at a time into the chambers of your revolver. And so Officer Pence was trying to complete this very dexterous, delicate operation of inserting 1 round at a time into his gun at the same time that he's being shot multiple times with the .45 caliber pistol. And unfortunately, he is just about to finish loading his revolver, and Twining has advanced on his position, and he sneaks up to him and he executes him with a shot to the head. Pence had actually got all 6 chambers of his revolver loaded, and all he had to do was close the cylinder into the frame and pull the trigger. He would have been back in the fight. But unfortunately, the nature of his wounds prevented him from doing that, and so he was executed with 1 shot to the head by Twining. There's a third storyline that runs through this, which is interesting. And the storyline is that there's a citizen that's driving to work, and his name is Gary Kness. Gary is a former Marine with combat experience in Korea, and he sees the second CHP cruiser containing Allen and Pence drive past him as they exit at Henry Mayo Drive and drive up the old road into the service station. And Gary's driving on that way because he's going to work at that time of night. And Gary follows the CHP cruiser loosely up past the service station, and he sees this gunfight playing out. And Gary would tell us later that he thought at first it was some kind of movie being filmed. He didn't think it was a real incident. But he realized pretty quickly that this was a real gunfight that was happening. And so he stopped his vehicle a little bit short of the driveway where our officers are having this running gun battle. And he sees things playing out, and he sees Officer Allen go down from Davis's attack with a shotgun. And Gary decides that he's going to try to help rescue Officer Allen. So Officer Allen is laying immobilized at the rear of the rightmost CHP cruiser. He's being shot at by Davis with the revolver that he stole from Officer Frago's holster. And Gary runs into the middle of this gunfight unarmed with the intent to try to drag Allen to a position of cover so that he can't be shot at anymore. And he tries to move Allen. He's unable to move him. And the gunfire from Davis continues to increase. And so Gary starts to look around for a weapon to defend himself and Allen with. And he picks up the empty shotgun that Officer Allen had previously ran dry. And about this time, Davis leaves the front of the Pontiac to assault the position a second time with the revolver. And as he's advancing on the position, Gary Kness picks up that unloaded shotgun and points it at him. And Davis sees the shotgun getting pointed at him, and he immediately retreats back to the front of the Pontiac for cover. Gary pulls the trigger on that shotgun, and unfortunately, it's empty. There's nothing in it. He realizes that he needs another gun to fight with, and so he looks around and he sees Officer Allen's revolver that's laying on the ground there. And Davis launches yet a third assault from the front of the Pontiac on their position and starts to advance on the Pontiac and Gary's position there. And Gary takes Officer Allen's revolver and he cocks it into single action mode and rests his elbows on the trunk of the CHP cruiser, and he fires one round in the revolver at Davis as he advances. Unfortunately, this round doesn't hit Davis cleanly. Instead, it impacts the Pontiac and it fragments, but a fragment of it winds up hitting Davis in the chest. And it's the first time now in this fight that Davis has been hit. And from that moment on, Davis is now disinterested in continuing the fight. He spends the rest of this time trying to escape the scene. He breaks away, runs around the front of the Pontiac, and he tries to enter into the driver's side door to make his getaway after getting hit by this fragment from Gary. Gary tries to fire the revolver again, but lands on another empty chamber. And so he's realized that, he's in the middle of this gunfight now. He's just fired 2 weapons dry. It doesn't appear to be anything else that he can do. And as this is going through his head, to his left, he hears the final round from Twining's .45 automatic as he executes Pence. And he looks over and he sees Officer Pence go down with the fatal wound to the head, the execution shot to the head. So Gary's in a tough spot here. He's got empty guns. All of the CHP officers are down, and he's hearing additional sirens coming in the distance, so he knows the cavalry is coming. So Gary decides that this is probably a pretty good time for him to leave, and so he flees the scene, and he runs back in the direction of where his car was parked because he feels like there's nothing else that he can do to help these guys at this moment. After executing Officer Pence, Twining has run his 1911 pistol dry. And so what he does is he walks back towards the Pontiac to make his getaway with his partner Davis. Davis is jumping in the driver's seat to drive it away. And Twining stops by the fallen Officer Gore, the first officer that was searching Davis at the beginning of this gunfight. And he picks up his revolver from the ground and arms himself with that, and proceeds to try to get into the Pontiac to make their getaway. At this time, a third CHP cruiser is showing up on scene that contains Erwin Holmes and Robbie Robinson, and they pull up on the scene. They see that the gunfire. They see the suspects trying to make their getaway. And Twining I mistakenly said that he had run his pistol dry after executing Pence, but he actually had 1 round left in his 1911 pistol. And what he does is he fires that at this third arriving CHP car. And the round actually hits the passenger side door of this CHP cruiser as Officer Robinson is getting out the passenger side of that vehicle with his shotgun. And Officer Irwin Holmes, the driver of that vehicle, has seen Twining shoot at his partner. And so he fires several rounds at Twining as Twining gets into the getaway car, into the Pontiac. Unfortunately, does not strike him. Officer Robinson is exiting the vehicle with his 870 shotgun, and he encounters Gary Kness, who's running away from the scene. And there's a little bit of a surreal exchange here that we can talk about later when we talk about mental issues. But you have to consider Gary is covered with Officer Allen's blood from trying to help him. And he's holding Officer Allen's revolver in his hand still. And with the other hand, he's pointing and saying, the bad guys are over in that direction. You got to go get them. And Robbie, when I talked with him later, told me that he never once saw the blood. He never once saw the gun. His attention was so channelized and so focused that, he essentially only heard Gary saying the bad guys are that way and pointing that direction. So fortunately, we didn't have fratricide here where Robbie mistakenly thought that Gary was one of the bad guys. But Robbie goes and he runs in the direction of the Pontiac just as it's taking off, and he's unable to fire a shot at it with his shotgun. And our bad guys drive off a little distance into the corner of this large parking lot, and there they abandon the getaway car. The getaway car's got a flat tire in it. It doesn't look like it's going to drive very far on that flat tire. And so what they do is they abandon it. And the 2 bad guys wind up going different directions in the night. There's a river wash that runs underneath the interstate in that location. And so one bad guy goes one direction underneath the interstate, and the other one goes the opposite direction. And they both flee the scene. And later on in the evening, Davis, who went underneath the interstate over to the eastern side there, he's going to be arrested by LA County Sheriff's deputies at a roadblock that they set up as they cast a net looking for these guys. Twining is going to escape and travel several miles south on foot, and he's going to take a family hostage in the hills that are to the west side of the interstate. And ironically, the home that he takes this family hostage in is just above where the Highway Patrol Station is located at the time. Just down the hill is located the Highway Patrol Station. So Twining is going to take the family hostage. A family member is going to be able to call the law enforcement authorities and escape the scene and notify them of what's going on. And so as the day progresses, Twining is going to be killed in engagement with the LA County Sheriff's SEB team as they make entry into the home to resolve the hostage situation. And there's some speculation as to whether or not he was killed by officers or if he actually committed suicide. I think the official story is that he committed suicide, and that's probably what happened. But there are legends also that he may have been shot by some of the officers and assisted suicide, if you will. And but I believe it was a suicide. He committed suicide with the shotgun, the CHP shotgun that he stole from the scene. So,
Mike, pardon the interruption, but that having read the book, that is about as concise and at the same time complete summary I think that anybody could give of the incident, which makes sense because you did write the book on the incident. Again, the book is Newhall Shooting, a Tactical Analysis by Mike Wood. You have to get this book if you have any interest in law enforcement tactics, survival, and the history of law enforcement in this country. I mean, this is a pivotal point, and we're going to talk about exactly why this incident was and is pivotal in the history of law enforcement in this country. And we're going to do that in our next episode. And I want you to tell everybody that you could think should hear about this to tune in for our next episode here coming up. We're going to get into the tactics. We're going to get into some of the history, I think, of the perpetrators. We'll get into the mindset of the officers, their training, weapons, and where we have come to at this point from April of 1970. So for today, I want to say thank you to Bill Bodner, my partner in crime, pardon the pun, that's just Mark Garrett being silly, and for Mike Wood, the author of this tremendous book. Thank you both, and we will see you at the next show to get into more detail about the impact this incident has had on the United States of America. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.